So, welcome to the second part of the Spotfire to Excel tutorial. This time we're going to be focusing on how to set up an IronPython script from Spotfire that can open up and interact with an Excel workbook. One application of this skill is that you can use Spotfire data tables to export to a colorful and automated Excel report, using Spotfire itself as the user interface and its built-in IronPython engine as the back end. If you haven't seen part 1 where I showed you a ready-to-go script that will export Spotfire tables directly to Excel, please check out the previous video. The main package we will be using is XLSX Writer. The essence of working with XLSX Writer is understanding this basic hierarchy where at the top level you're dealing with the workbook level, which is basically the whole Excel window, or I'm not going to say window yet, but just the page of Excel that you're seeing with multiple sheets, which is the second part of the hierarchy, worksheets, otherwise known as tabs, and then within each worksheet you have range at the bottom level, which corresponds to selections of cells within each worksheet. So once you understand this, you have the ability of opening up multiple workbooks and worksheets and selecting which worksheet you want to work on, and then within each sheet you can select ranges of cells that you can apply formatting and set values to. So you can see XLSX is a powerful tool for bringing your code to life within Excel. So first let's go over the necessary Spotfire imports to allow Spotfire to communicate with your system's Excel via IronPython. So first we have these are just your normal inputs that we went over in the last video to basically read from data tables and write them to Excel. We're still going to need those. What's new? Well, I guess what's not new, but I guess this is sort of relevant to this video, is CLR, which stands for the Common Language Runtime, and this manages execution of .NET programs. Interop is what allows our program to communicate with other Microsoft Office products such as Excel, which we added here. So you can use this line. I'm pretty sure this public key token will work still. If not, shouldn't be too hard to find, but it is public. And then from Interop we got to import Excel here by this, but this is after we added to CLR. And then last but not least, we import CSV just for writing CSV lines easier, and datetime, so that we can title our Excel worksheet or tabs with the current datetime. So CLR, we're going to need to add the reference system.drawing because there's some color codes that we need in order to translate RGB colors to the way Excel reads colors, which is OLE, and that's what this function does. It just converts RGB values for Excel and returns the Excel appropriate value. Now, if you're getting errors when importing these above packages, you may need to talk to your IT support to make sure that all the appropriate software is installed on your Spotfire client server. There may be a similar solution to get this to work on the Spotfire web server. However, I was never able to get it to work on my company's Spotfire, so I cannot promise that these scripts will work on Spotfire web. And with that being said, now we can open up a workbook. So we have two choices. We can open up a workbook using the data table script from part 1, so that we have an Excel workbook populated already with our Spotfire data table. Or we can start from scratch and start with an empty workbook and add the values in manually or programmatically. So here I start by using part of the script I wrote for part 1 to save our Spotfire data table to a CSV file, and then using Excel to open that CSV file as a workbook with our data already populated. So once a workbook has been chosen, it is said to have been activated, thus allowing us to add and choose worksheets within the workbook. So there are two ways you can go by opening a workbook in Excel. One way is once you have to have this data to write into a file to read from, or from any CSV file. You can open it from a CSV file, like I do in the lines of code from 51 to 57. And so if we run that, going to comment out the rest of the code. And a quick Python tip is you can use 3 quotes to encapsulate a huge chunk of code you want to comment out. So if we run that, we get an Excel file reading from temp, which was the name of the temp file for the CSV that we saved of our iris data. So that's what we get right here. Or we can open up an empty Excel workbook by using this line of code here and on 61. X is not defined. Maybe I commented too much. So we still need the setup for the Excel session here. So we got to set up the Excel application class, and I'm saying that to EX. EX.visible equals true is what makes the Excel workbook actually visible on the screen when your code runs, which is cool. If you're running like a lengthy report, you get to see the edits and the colors come on the screen in real time, which is kind of satisfying to watch sometimes. Display alerts equals false should be self-explanatory. Yeah, so the mistake I made there was I commented too much actually. We really just want to comment out this line if we want to open up the empty workbook here. So you're just going to use ex.workbooks add as opposed to open with the file name here. And if we run that, we will get the empty Excel. And then now we can make our edits as we please. But for the rest of the tutorial, actually, I'm going to actually leave this commented and work with the iris dataset using ex.workbooks.openTemp. And I'm going to be saving my workbook variable in Python under the name workbook. So from there, we can now add tabs, or they're known as sheets in the Excel.Interop or XLSX writer language. So here I do a for loop to add 3 sheets A, B, and C into our workbook object, and I name each sheet A, B, and C here. So that's what this for loop does right there. So yeah, we can run that real quick if I do my comments correctly. And so now you see we have a sheet for A, B, and C, and actually it automatically named our 4th sheet iris because that's the data that we're reading from. So when we do the for loop to add the sheets, it adds 3 new sheets, so that leaves us with 4. So after the workbook level, we can access different sheets. I'm going to call this one output, and the way to access it is use workbook.sheets, and then these are brackets, sort of like an array of sheets. You're going to call it by its name, which is iris, and that's going to give us, it's going to activate the iris sheet and make that the one that's visible, and that it's going to be tied to output here. So after we activate the sheet we would like to control, all there is left to do in the hierarchy is select a range of cells we would like to control. And there are various ways to select a range of cells, and I'll demonstrate them with the common ways you may want to format your cells in the workbook. So here I have a bunch of different lines of code dealing with alignment, namely horizontal alignment. So we'll see what that does, but here I've got the align center, align right, left, distributed, and fill, and we'll see what those do in just a second. But if you want more details on how to find these, or what their names are, or what they do, the link in the Microsoft.NET Framework APIs are all publicly available, and I'm going to link these into the link to the description, because that is the most critical part of this tutorial, is knowing where to look for most of your information. But I want to be the one to tell you where to look and how to know what to look for, if that makes any sense. So got the rest of the code highlighted. We're going to see what these 5 or so lines of code do real quick. And so you can see that the first line of code takes cell position 1, 1 and accesses its horizontal alignment and sets it equal to center. So that's why this cell right here, sepal length, is centered in 1. row 1. Here is another, so that's one way to access the range, is to use the sheet name .cells and do the index locator, and it's going to be 1 based index, no 0 based here. Another way to do it is to do output, or your sheet variable .range, and you use a string for the cell name that Excel uses, like B2 or any letter combination with the number. And so B2 we'll see has the right horizontal alignment. So if you look at B2, the number 3.5 is indeed hugging the right side of the cell, which is as expected. Another way to choose the range is to do what we did before, but with a colon. So this right here will select multiple cells from C1 to C20, and in fact, it's always going to be a rectangular shape. So if you did D20, it will be a 20 by 2 rectangular selection of column C's and 20, or C and D. And so here we expect these first 20 cells of column C to have left alignment, which they do. Except for number 3, because in the next line of code we'll see that I did output.rows horizontal alignment is going to be distributed. So this shows that Python is a sequential or a synchronous program, so one line of code waits for the other. So that's why this line of code overrides what happens in 87, and that's why C3 here has a distributed horizontal alignment, which just basically means, I guess, it's in the center. Not really sure what's the difference between that and center. Maybe it's in the documentation. And so lastly we go into columns. You can also select it by columns and then using a string E, and that's another way to select the range. So I have 5 different ways of selecting ranges here, and then that one's going to give us Excel horizontal alignment fill, and we can see what that does if we expand column E real quick. Kind of just fills it with the same value. I don't know why you'd ever want to use that, but if you have a need for it, that's the line of code you use. Great, so next we are going to be using pretty much all 5 of these different ways of accessing ranges of cells to show you other formatting things you can do in Excel. So let's check this out. We're going to now pre-format widths of columns and headers. So this is, we've already seen this before. This is just a way of selecting a column, and then now we're going to show what the column width property does, and as you would expect, it adjusts the column width. I forget what the units are, but you can play around with them until it seems right. And yeah, we're going to set these all to 16, but column E is going to be 32 just to show. And yeah, I get this error when I run the script because, as always, when you're doing Excel and Python and Spotfire, you can't have an Excel workbook open and then expect to open it with the same name. You got to close it before you want to rerun the script. So that's what happened there. And we see that when we go to the Iris tab, yeah, I don't know why I did that. Yeah, everything was 16 width, but this one was twice as big as 30. Column E is going to be 32, so that's why this one got really wide. Great, and so yeah, same thing with row height. Instead of column width, now you select the range cells using rows or whatever selector of ranges you want to use, and you can access their property called the row height, and that will adjust accordingly. And we can see how that looks real quick. It takes a second. Oh, okay. Yeah, so you can see here rows 10 and 20 have a different height now, because those are the 2 that I called right here, 10 and 20. So now we can talk about colors. So here I select different ranges and color them. So here I already introduced you to the function that I wrote to convert colors from RGB to something that Excel understands, which I believe it's called OLE. Haven't done much research on that topic, just note that it uses a function, pre-written function that works already, and so the main takeaway from this is this property right here. If you want to color the interior color, which I believe is going to be the border, or I mean the fill behind the text, you're going to use interior.color, but you can also change the font color using .font.color. and these are all just being called once again on a range of cells within a sheet. So here we expect different colors here for these cell ranges. I think these are just headers because we're just doing the first cells here, A1 through E1, and then some random stuff is going on here that we're about to see. Yep, so that shows us the different colors for A1, B1, C1 and D1 have their own color, and E1 has its own color as expected. And then we also showcase that you can choose a rectangular, bigger range of cells and still apply the same color scheme to them using this great pink color. And then lastly, D20 through E30 looks at the font color, and that changed as well to a peach for cells D20 to E30. So this works as intended. Not the prettiest looking report, but I hope it's teaching you guys a little bit more about XLSX Writer. So now I'm going to move on to line style. So this has to do with the borders of each cell. So here I'm going to take cells, the range of cells from A2 to B2, just those two cells of the second row, and we're going to access their border line style property. And then the link is above in the code here. You can see what each of these does, but there's different line styles you can do in Excel. There's the continuous, the dash dot, and I'm sure there's many others. So that's what we're going to see on those cells here. Yeah, we're also going to adjust, let's also just adjust the font size of some cells using .font.size. You can mess with the italics or the bold. Pretty much anything you can do in Excel, there's a way to access that property in XLSX Writer and adjust it. It's just a matter of finding it. But here I try to introduce some of the ones you may use more often. So let's just stop right there and run it, see how that looks like. Wonderful. And so here we see that border between A1 and A2 and B2 is in fact a solid border there. And we see the dotted border around these cells as well, C3 to E3. So those take care of that. And then as for the font sizes, we see that A2 through A12 font sizes remain 10, but whereas B2, these values in column B, the fonts are adjusted now to 14. And then A3 is now bold and italic, and that's what lines 123 and 124 did. Now probably the most important part of this tutorial is setting actual values. So that can be done by selecting a range of cells again, and then now accessing the value 2 property. Don't ask me why there's a 2 there. Value 1 doesn't really work as intended, but value 2 does. So almost done here, but yeah, this is the most important part. We're going to now set values in column F to different things. I don't know why I had F2 there. That's going to just keep editing the same cells. Let's do F2, 3, 4, and 5. Check those out real quick. And we got hungry, angry, happy, okay. There. With the pre-formatted, the pre-formatting still applies. So it's interesting to note that since angry is in row 3, it's still going to be centered horizontal alignment because that's what we called earlier. Or I think it was distributed. Interesting side note there. So here's how you save a workbook. Ours is already saved with the iris name, but you can save it again using the save as on the workbook object. And so you can feel free to use this line of code here I wrote to save it as today's date. So let's take a look at that. So here you see iris.csv just changed to 2020-09-10.csv, today's date. And then lastly, we're going to talk about some cool stuff like zoom, adjusting the zoom and freezing different panes, and yeah, that's it really for the rest of the tutorial. Because I found this to be a little bit trickier than the other stuff because it falls into the categories of a new object in Excel called windows, which are a little bit different than sheets. The window is basically what you see on the screen. Whatever sheet is activated and what your eyeballs can see on the screen, that's the window that Excel is showing you right now. So the trick here is to I don't know if you noticed, but every time we run this script, it goes into a different tab when it outputs. I think it's the C tab. But what we really want to do is activate the Iris tab, because that's the one we want to do stuff on. So if we activate the Iris tab by using this line of code here, our window object now switches over to that tab. And so there's only going to be as number of windows as there are workbooks, I believe. And since we only have one workbook open, we're going to be accessing the first window. And once we access that object, that window object, we can adjust its properties, like zoom. We can set that to 120 now. So I'm going to run this script real quick. Gotta do my triple quotes here. So here you saw it was in column C, but now we're back on Iris, and the zoom is now 120%. And then the last cool thing you can do with the Windows property that would be most useful would be freezing panes. So here's the way you want to do that. First, you want to access the window and do freeze panes equals false, so that you can now split the columns and split the rows. So basically these column row splits will be where the freezing occurs. So we're gonna freeze the first 4 columns and the first 2 rows, and then everything after that will be adjustable. And then after that is done, we will set freeze panes equals to true. And since that's the last part of this tutorial, we can remove the triple quotes and see if it works. Alright, so let's moment of truth. You can see that these first 2 rows here, 1 and 2, stay as we scroll up and down, and when we scroll side to side, wonderful. A, B, C, and D remain fixed, and now you can see that this is the correct way to freeze panes for XLSX Writer.